Good afternoon. Welcome to the Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Native Prairie Appreciation Week Speaker Series. My name is Carolyn Gannett, and I am the manager of the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This week is Native Prairie Appreciation Week. Saskatchewan is the only jurisdiction in North America that proclaims Native Prairie Appreciation Week, which is devoted to raising awareness and appreciation of native grasslands. It is jointly proclaimed by Saskatchewan Ministries of Agriculture and Environment, as well as the cities of Regina, Saskatoon, Weyburn, Moose Jaw, and Swift Current. Earlier this year, the Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan and the Society for Range Management Prairie Parkland chapter were planning a native prairie tour when the pandemic derailed our plans. So we decided to have the elements of the tour available as webinars, including presentations related to native prairie for a general audience and some training opportunities. Usually we would have plant ID as part of the tour out in the field, so we thought it would be a great addition to this week's lineup. So this afternoon's webinar is Prairie Plant Identification with Amanda Muller, and she'll be going through how to ID some plants, and then we'll have a quiz. If you would like to participate in the quiz, you will need two devices, one for the webinar to see the plant and the other for Kahoot, which is the app that will be used for the quiz. And Amanda will talk more about how to get Kahoot. Now, before Amanda gets started, I'll just mention a few housekeeping items. All of the Native Prairie Appreciation Week Speaker Series webinars are recorded and will be available on PCAP's YouTube channel. Just search YouTube for SK PCAP and you should find it in over 100 of our recorded webinars. If you have any questions during the presentation, in the webinar pop-up, there is a place to type in questions, and I will moderate questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type in your questions during the presentation as you think of them. And just a reminder that there is still the Native Prairie photo contest going on PCAP's Facebook page. You will have until midnight tonight to vote for your favorites, so go check that out. Next week, we will go back to our regular Native Prairie Speaker Series on Monday the 22nd with a presentation by Dr. Ryan Brook about wild boar. There are a few spots left to register if you'd like to join us for that. And then in July, there will be a webinar on identifying the big weeds. So you can learn something about IDing our native plants today and then learn to identify invasives in July. There's more information about both of those upcoming webinars on PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series webpage. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by Amanda Muller and the University of Saskatchewan, and we really appreciate Amanda volunteering to do this presentation for everyone today. Now, a bit about our presenter. Amanda Muller is a plant ecology lab instructor in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. While completing her BSc in Renewable Resource Management, she started working in a plant ecology lab, and she has never left. She is a plant ecologist at heart, though she is taking her PhD in soil science currently. Amanda is also a director on the Society for Range Management Board and coaches the U of S range team. And with that, I'll pass it off to Amanda and she can get started.
Thanks, Carolyn. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Like Carolyn mentioned, today is really just an introduction to basic plant ID of some native prairie plants. And then because this is such a strange time and normally we would have a quiz in person, we do have an interactive quiz that we're going to try and get going at the end of this presentation. So normally when we go out on these tours, so SRM has Native Prairie Appreciation Week tours or Back to the Field tours that we often put on. normally there is a plant ID portion. And so usually when I'm out teaching plant ID, we're able to go out and see those plants really close up. We're able to touch them, we're able to smell them, we're able to pull back the plant parts to look at finer plant parts. And so this is a very different medium than I'm used to. And it's going to be a little bit tough not being able to see all your wonderful faces, but I'm hoping that by the end of this, you have a bit of a platform to jump off and explore things yourself. So before I get started today, even though we're gathering virtually, I did want to acknowledge that I am bringing you this webinar from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. And so we pay our respects to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. As Carolyn mentioned, I'm a lab instructor in plant ecology and I help out with a bunch of field courses. And this is my face. So I find it very strange that I can't see all of you, but hopefully you have an idea now of who is speaking to you. So like I said, we're going to start off with a bit of an introduction to terminology and basic plant ID. The way my presentation is structured is I really want to focus on 4 different plant families and focus on the patterns within those families. So today, what we're really going to look at is how to identify patterns in the aster family, the legume family, and the rose family. So just to give you some context, when we think about some of the forb or flowering species that we see out on the prairie or some of our shrubs, they belong to these 3 groups. So in Saskatchewan, there are over 230 species, not all of them grassland species, but of aster. So that's a huge family in terms of plant ID. And so if we can recognize the patterns in that family and narrow things down to it, that makes things a lot easier when we get into the field if we have something that's unknown. Same thing goes with legumes. We have over 83 species of legumes in Saskatchewan. We've got 74 species of rose in the province. And then, of course, we have a whole whack of grasses. And we know that grasses make up a big part of our prairies. And so in total, there are about 173 individual species of grass in the province. And again, these aren't all found in our prairies. Some of them are north, but just to give you an idea. Of those 173 species, about 124 are native, and 51% of, or 51 of those are provincially rare. So that narrows things down. We have a group of plants, a group of grasses that are native, and the common ones, there are fewer than obviously 173. So we're going to focus on 2 different groups of grasses. And if we could identify the species in these groups, then hopefully that'll get you on your way to identifying more grasses in the future. And then, of course, I'm going to cover some common plants, just generally of the Saskatchewan prairies. But most of them are going to belong to these groups. So like I said, to finish things off, we're going to be doing an interactive quiz using the platform called Kahoot. And so like Carolyn mentioned, in order to do this, you're going to have 2 devices, or you're going to have to be able to split up your computer monitor so you can see the pictures that I'm posting, as well as being able to respond in the app. Or on the website. And so you can either access Kahoot using the website kahoot.com, or you can download the app in the App Store, which just is this symbol here. All right. So to get started, I have to say I'm doing something I normally don't do. Today, in the interest of time and space on my slides, I'm going to be using common names, which is really good for introducing people to plant ID. But when I teach, normally we're always using the binomial Latin names. And so I would feel very amiss if I didn't at least mention the importance of Latin names. So just an example, I have 2 species down here. Both of them are sages, and they have 2 distinct Latin names that are used to differentiate these species. So each Latin name is made up of 2 parts. There is the genus name, which is the first one that's capitalized, and then the species name, which is the lowercase name that follows that. And so we've got Artemisia frigida and Artemisia ludoviciana. And these names are really important for distinguishing distinct species from one another. And these names do change over time, but at least when they change, there is some scientific literature or there's databases that track those name changes. When it comes to common names, it's really important to recognize that these vary depending on where you are in Canada. They differ culturally, and the same common name can apply to several different species. So I'm going to be using the common names that we typically use in Saskatchewan, but just recognize that there are regional and cultural differences. And the best example, like I said, are of these two species. So on the left-hand side, we have pasture sage, or sometimes it's called fringe sage. On the right side, we have prairie sage. And so those are the common Saskatchewan names. Now, when I was in the field last summer with some Indigenous students, I had a woman come up to me and say, "Oh, I recognize these species." She said, "This one over here, which I called prairie sage, is woman sage because it's soft and the leaves are very soft. And this one on the left here that I called pasture sage is man sage. And my grandma told me it was called man sage because it has balls. And the flowers kind of have this ball-like arrangement." And so just to give you an idea, culturally, the common names of these differ. So that's my little caveat for you. In terms of plant ID resources, a lot of people ask me, what do you use to ID plants in the field? So these are some of the common ones for Saskatchewan grasslands and grasslands of just the West in general. And I've put some stars on the ones that I typically use in the field. So there's the 3 volumes of the common plants of the Western rangelands. I typically now teach with the Trees and Shrubs book and the Forbs book because I've traded in their grasses and grass-like species book for the Flora of Saskatchewan book, though I do still reference that old book for myself sometimes. On the right-hand side, we have the field guides provided by the Saskatchewan Forage Council. These you can download for free actually on the PCAP website. And these are the ones that I typically give out to students to use in the field when I'm doing rangeland resources and field courses. So these are really good free resources that you can use. And the last one that I'm starting to teach with the range team is North American wildland plants. And this gives an overview of all of the native grassland plants across North America, or at least the common ones. And this is the one that the range team is going to be using from now on. So as you notice, those books are kind of divided up into sections. That's because there are some main plant types that we need to learn to recognize to figure out which plant ID resource we're actually going to need to use to identify a plant. And this may seem very, very basic, but I cannot count the number of times where I've asked a student to key out a plant and I find them in the wrong book just because they've overlooked some little feature that should have pointed them in the direction of another book. And so when we talk about main plant types, I'm typically talking about grasses and grass-like species. So those are going to be our grasses, our sedges, and our rushes. Our forbs are our herbaceous flowering plants. And so we can have annuals or perennial species, but generally speaking, their stems are not woody, though they may have woody rhizomes or woody plant bases, the stems themselves are not woody. And then our shrubs and trees do have woody tissue. And so what that means is they may have bark, they may have, if you cut into them, you may see tree rings or rings that form from that annual growth. And so that woody tissue in the stems is what really differentiates the forbs from the trees and the shrubs. There's a lot of terminology that comes with plant ID, and I myself feel like I am still learning all of the terminology and I have to look up things constantly. It can be very overwhelming to folks that are just learning plant ID when they look in a book and they see all this terminology. Not all of it can be useful right off when you're just starting out. So I just wanted to point out a few things that you should pay attention to. So the first thing is understanding, say, what is a flower and what are the parts that we typically use to identify plants. And so very obviously, when we look at a flower, the first thing we typically notice are going to be the petals or the showy, flat, colorful things in the flower. Collectively, the petals are called the corolla. So that's just another word that we use to refer to those petals. Underneath the petals, we often will find sepals, and those tend to be more green leafy, though they're sometimes colored, parts of the flower. And collectively, the sepals are called the calyx. So petals, corolla, sepals, calyx. And then we also have the sexual parts of the flower. So we have our male parts, which are collectively referred to as stamens, and our female parts that are collectively referred to as pistils. And so those are the main plant or flower parts that we use in terms of terminology for identifying the different features of a flower. Now, those flowers are often arranged in very different ways, and there's a lot of terminology for how those might be arranged. The key thing here is not to necessarily memorize this picture here, but to realize that usually when you have a plant ID book, there's going to be some pictographs that actually will break down these types of flower patterns for you. So even those Saskatchewan Forage Council books, they will have a diagram somewhat like this that will help you guide and determine what type of flower arrangement you have. So we might have something like a spike where we have flowers directly attached to a central stem. We might have a raceme where instead of those flowers being attached directly, they actually each have their own little branch. Or we might have a more compound arrangement, more branching pattern, which would be considered something like a panicle. Other than the flowers, we are typically going to use the leaves and how they're arranged on a stem to identify a plant. And similar to those flower arrangements, we don't want you to memorize all of these different leaf shapes. Just know that there are different names for different leaf shapes, and oftentimes the leaf shape of a plant is going to be a combination or be a range of leaf shapes depending on where it's growing. So often you'll get something that is round to reniform, or you'll have a range of leaf shapes that are provided to you. Those leaf shapes or leaves also have different parts of them that might have more characteristic shapes. So we might see a description of the leaf margin, and it could be from entire, which would mean there are no teeth on it or very few teeth, or they might be very serrated, like a serrated knife. And so there's different levels of how bumpy the edges of leaves are. Same thing goes with the leaf bases. Now, another thing we want to pay attention to is how are leaves attached to the stem? So are they attached with a little stem, so a petiole? Are they sessile? Are they attached directly to the stem? Or are they even maybe clasping the stem? So all of these things differ between species. Leaf arrangement is another thing that we typically look at in plant ID. And oftentimes there are some main ones that we observe. We can have leaves that are alternating up the stem, leaves that are opposite from one another going up the stem. And opposite is, I mean, a lot of plants have alternate leaves. Opposite is a characteristic we definitely want to look out for because it can help narrow things down. Whorled, which basically means that a bunch of leaves are attached at the same point. And then we can have a rosette, which would be kind of a whorled arrangement of leaves, but at the base of the plant. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is compound leaves. So oftentimes we find these very unique arrangement of leaves or smaller leaflets into these compound leaf arrangements. And so we could have palmate or pinnate leaf arrangements. And basically the key thing here is actually when it comes to these arrangements, this whole thing is considered a leaf. So that palmate leaf there, that whole thing is considered a leaf. And the parts of that leaf are actually called leaflets. And so oftentimes when you're looking at plant ID books, they'll refer to the leaflets, and that's going to be an indication that you're looking at a compound leaf. And of course, those come in all sorts of arrangement. And again, we don't want you to memorize these, but just be aware that there are so many different leaf shapes and arrangements that you can find on our forbs and trees. So I'm going to start off primarily talking about the forbs and shrubs, and then we're going to move on to some grasses. Like I said, the Aster family is a really large family. Most of the ones in Saskatchewan are obviously going to be our forbs. There's 230 species in Saskatchewan. And so when we're in the field, this is usually one of the first things we ask students. Is it an aster? And if not, let's figure out what else it is. And so we make them think through, first, is this an aster? If they say no, then we can go on to something else. And asters are differentiated from other plant species because they have a very specific head. And so when you typically learn to draw a flower as a kid, you draw that circle, and then you draw those petals on the outside of it, and like a little daisy or a sunflower. Well, those are the plants of the aster family. And that center circle that you draw is actually a disc made up of many, many small flowers. And so they're considered composite heads because they're composed of many flowers. And those petals that you draw on the outside of that disc are actually flowers themselves as well. And so we might call these ray flowers. So the key thing with asters is that disc in the center made up of many flowers. Those petals on the outside aren't actually petals, they're actually individual flowers themselves, and that's what makes up an aster. The other thing that we pay attention to is these flower heads are also going to be held up by these layers of bracts, so this bottom corner here. And that's a bunch of little leafy features that are actually holding that flower head together or up. So there's also these bracts, and I'll point those out in some pictures later on. In terms of how there's huge diversity in the aster family, first of all. So you might actually have a flower like a dandelion, or this is a native false dandelion, that are just made up of those petal flowers. You might also have composite or asters that are made up of just those disc flowers. And so this is native dotted blazing star. And so this would also include things like our thistles, or we can have both. So here's our common annual sunflower or gaillardia that have both the disc and those ray flowers. So just to show you some of the diversity, here are 3 common species that we see in our native grasslands that often help us see other common similar species and you learn to differentiate between them. So the first one is smooth aster. And so it's got these beautiful blue-purple flowers that have obviously those are the rays, and the center is yellow disc flowers. They've got fairly thick lance-like leaves. And one of the things that is really distinct about this plant is it has clasping leaves that alternate up the stem. And so for this species, those clasping leaves is really important. The plant also tends to be glabrous or hairless, which is where that smooth aster comes from. Goldenrods are so bright and beautiful on the prairie, and always I find them very, very cheery. Canada goldenrod is one of the bigger goldenrods that we see, but there is a huge diversity of them in the province, or I wouldn't say huge, there are quite a number of them in the province. So Canada goldenrod is distinguished from others by this broad pyramidal panicle. So if you look at it and it's open, it can form this pyramid shape. Even though the flowers are very, very small, they are made up of both gray and disc flowers, and they're both yellow. The stems and leaves tend to be short, finely hairy, and the leaves alternate up the stem. And unlike smooth aster, these ones tend to be just mostly stalkless, so they aren't clasping. The next one here is gumweed, which I think is quite funny plant, also very bright. And one of the most distinguishing features about this are these very sticky bracts. So if we look under those flowers, those petal or ray flowers, you can see these layers of bracts. And if you touch them, they're very, very sticky. So generally speaking, that's one of the key things that when you're looking at this plant that you would use to distinguish it from others. Now, not all asters are quite as showy. So those two plants that I showed you at the very beginning of the presentation are also asters. So pasture sage and prairie sage are both considered asters. And so they do have those composite flower heads, but they're a lot less distinct. So for me, it's easier for me to just remember that if it's silvery, aromatic, it smells like sage, that it's actually in the aster family. And so between the two of these, pasture sage has these feathery dissected leaves that remind me a little bit of like a shag carpet. And so usually these form mats over the prairie, which is quite distinct. And then they have these narrow panicles with yellow flowers that come up. And typically underneath the flowers, those bracts are quite woolly, hairy. Prairie sage, like I said, is a hairy, soft plant, has much wider blades, brownish flowers and panicles, but generally speaking, much wider blades than that pasture sage. The last aster that I'm going to introduce you to is common yarrow, and many of you may have this in your gardens. I sure do. So this is one where we have these flat-topped or rounded-topped flower heads or inflorescences, and these are made up with, again, those composite flower heads or composite flowers. What's really interesting or distinct about this one is it's pretty easy to identify just from the leaves, even if they're juveniles, because they look like ferns or they're considered feathery dissected, but they just look like little fern leaves. So it's pretty distinct. Moving on to our next family, we have our legumes. And so these have, again, a very distinct flower shape. This is when we think of our peas. So they have what we consider irregular flowers, which means our petals are all different shaped. If we have a regular flower, all our flower petals are the same. Here we have irregular flowers that have a very specific flower arrangement, or petal arrangement, sorry. So there's a big banner up top, we've got these wings, and the keel in the center. And so all legumes are going to have this. Legumes also tend to have pea-like pods, though these can vary significantly in their shape and size. And they also tend to have compound leaves. So I'll get to those examples. Our first one is golden bean, which is that beautiful yellow pea-like flower that you see in the spring. So those irregular flowers, they have flat curved pods that come off. And then the leaves, if you look at them, like I said, they're going to be compound leaves. And so we have leaves with 3 leaflets, which we can see here, but they also have these large leaf-like stipules where the leaf attaches to the stem. And so that is a characteristic feature of this plant. The next one I have is American vetch, which is actually my very favorite plant. And the reason it is my favorite plant is you find it everywhere, but it often goes unnoticed, and it can vary from being very small to quite large, depending on where you are in the province. And it's got these trailing and climbing stems that at the end of the trailing and climbing stems with these compound leaflets, and at the end of the leaflets, they have these tendrils or these little curly appendages that allow them to climb up other plants. They also have these really beautiful purple pink flowers. Next one is two-grooved milk vetch. And so this is in the Astragalus genus. I find Astragalus is particularly tricky, especially with students, because oftentimes we don't see them flowering and all we see are these pinnate leaves that are fairly distinctive of the Astragalus family among the other legumes. Two-groove milkvetch has a fairly strong odor, similar to golden bean, though this one has been described as not being quite as pleasant. They have dense racemes with reflexed red-purple flowers. What they mean by reflexed is that they kind of are, instead of going upwards, they are reflexed downwards. And so they kind of are in this downwards pattern along that central stem. When everything matures and the pods are present, the pods themselves have two grooves on the surface of them. And so that's where the name two-grooved comes from. Moving on to the rose family. One of the things I want to point out with the rose family is, again, it is quite diverse, similar to the asters, in that they can appear in many different forms. They can have everything from simple leaves to compound leaves, but the one thing that ties them all together is the flower pattern. And so here is where those plant parts become, or those flower parts, sorry, become really important. Roses always have 5 petals, 5 sepals, and numerous stamens. And what we mean by numerous stamens is it usually is more than twice the number of petals. So you're going to have more than 10 stamens in the center, but though you often will have more than that. So we have both roses and shrubs, but we also have some forbs. So some common forbs that you might already be familiar with would be something like wild strawberry. So wild strawberry has compound leaves. It has those 3 leaflets that make up the leaf. The flower, you see here the 5 white petals. It also has 5 green sepals. And if you look in the center of that flower, you're going to find many yellow stamens. 3-flowered avens, when you look at this flower, it's not quite as distinct as, say, the wild strawberry, but if you look very closely at the head, it will also have that flower arrangement. 3-flowered avens, or prairie smoke as some people call it, tends to have these flowering heads in groups of 3, which is quite distinct. You can also see these pinnate leaves that often form mats in the prairie, and these pinnate leaves have more wide wedge-shaped and serrated edges, so they're more toothed and divided. When this matures, the most beautiful thing are these seed heads, which have these feathery styles that create this prairie smoke name, and they're very distinct in the fields. We obviously also have some shrubs that are in the rose family. We have our roses, again, same flower arrangement. These are typically going to have bristly stems, as well as rose hips as a fruit. One of the things that distinguish between the different roses are whether or not they have large nodal spines. So nodal spines being where those leaves attach to the stem. In some species, they're larger than the other bristles, in others they aren't. Also, the number of leaflets is important. Some of our favorite prairie shrubs are also in the rose family. So we have our Saskatoon berries and our chokecherries that are also in the rose family. So our Saskatoon berries are going to have these interesting leaf shape that's pretty characteristic, where it's somewhat circular with a rounded tip. The rounded tip also tends to be toothed. So the bottom of the leaf is more entire, there aren't as many teeth, and then that rounded tip from about halfway up tends to be toothed. Our chokecherry has simple leaves similar to the Saskatoon berry, so it's not compound, and they've got these dense racemes with white flowers. So the leaves themselves, instead of being rounded, have a pointed tip, and they have finely toothed margins. When they mature, you get these dark red to black cherries that grow on the stems. So one species that typically gets mixed up with chokecherry is pincherry, but they have a different flower arrangement. So chokecherry has the raceme flower arrangement, and pincherry has a different one. So there's a few other families that I wanted to cover of shrubs because these are important species to shrubs and trees, I guess, that are important to recognize in our prairies as well. One is western snowberry, and the other is wolf willow in terms of shrubs. So these will often form large patches in the prairie, especially in the fescue prairie. Western snowberry has these oval-shaped leaves that are opposite one another, which is very characteristic. They have these white-pink flowers, and these, once they mature, they become these like more white berry clusters, where the snowberry comes from, but they can turn kind of greenish and not quite as white as you would expect given the name. Wolf willow is actually a nitrogen fixing shrub, and it can again form colonies. The stems of this species are what we call rusty brown and scaly. So if you look very closely, it has little scales along the stem. The leaves are very silvery, similar to a sage, and they have these fragrant yellow flowers. So you'll see these form quite large patches in the prairie. And the last one, most people are familiar with aspen stands in Saskatchewan, especially in the aspen parkland. They are a little bit less abundant down in the south where it's drier, but you'll also often find them in moist depressions. Most people can recognize these on site by the gray-white bark and the tall, slim trunks. But I did want to point out one particular thing to watch out for, especially if you have saplings coming up. This particular species has these flattened petioles. So there's these round pointed leaves, and then attaching to these leaves are these petioles that are flat. And the name trembling aspen comes from how those leaves move in the wind. And so instead of being rounded like many species, they're flat, which allows them to shake in the wind or quake in the wind, which I think is a really great way to recognize these plants. On to our grasses and grass-like species. Now I am running a little bit behind in time, so we're probably going to skip over this a little bit quicker. But I think it's really important to recognize the difference between our grasses, sedges, and rushes. So when we talk about grasses, those are in the family Poaceae, and these when you look at the stems, the leaves are two-ringed, so they come off in two directions on the stem. Where the leaves attach, we get these swollen nodes or bumps along the stem, which are very, very characteristic of this species, of all of the Poaceae. Sedges and rushes do not have these nodes. Sedges in particular tend to have three-ranged leaves, but they don't have these nodes. Rushes tend to be round and they don't have these nodes. So the key thing when you're looking at grasses is, does it have a node? If it does, yes, I have a grass. There's this poem that I always tell my students. Sedges have edges because they're triangular. Rushes are round. Grasses have nodes. What have you found? And that helps you remember whether or not you're looking at a grass or something else. In terms of basic grass identification, we look at growth form, height, color, and the type of inflorescence. In grasses, there are two main types of inflorescence. We have our spikes, which is what we see in our wheatgrasses, and we have our panicles, which are these flowering or more branched flowering heads that are in most other species. There are also some special different types of inflorescences like this comb-like spike that we see in characteristic of blue grama. And then there's other plant parts. So plant parts I want to draw your attention to is in our grasses, typically instead of calling it a stem, we call it a culm. And in particular, where the leaf meets the culm, there's a bunch of fine features that we can use to identify the plants. So sometimes when we pull back that leaf blade, we'll see what this membranous projection that we sometimes call a ligule. And then in other species, we have these little arms or ears that kind of wrap around the culm, and those are called auricles. Where that leaf blade wraps around the stem, we call it the sheath. We also, when we think about growth form, look at whether or not we have a tufted growth form with fibrous roots or whether or not we have plants that are more separated and maybe rhizomatous. So the two groups that I want to draw your attention to are our wheatgrasses or our needlegrasses. And these both have two distinct things that tell us whether or not we have wheatgrasses or needlegrass. Or if we don't have one of these things, it'll be something else. Our wheatgrasses are pretty much the only group that has the spike inflorescence. So that means that our little spikelets are attached directly to the central stem. They also have auricles that are usually present, but not always. And they come in different shapes and forms. Our needlegrasses have panicle inflorescences. And we can see in this one picture, there are these big sets of glooms. These ones are empty here. They're not empty down here. And these long glooms have a single floret, or in this, just for simplicity's sake, or seed. And these seeds each have a fairly large awn that's attached to the tip of them. And so those are our needlegrasses. Great for throwing at our siblings. There are three main wheatgrasses that I wanted to cover today. Northern wheatgrass, western wheatgrass, and awned wheatgrass. Just to kind of show you how some of these things differ from one another. The one I'm going to start with is western wheatgrass because for me it's the most distinct in the field. This one appears kind of more in solitary stems. It has this blue-green color, and the color is always really relative to one another, but this one truly does have this bluish white tinge to it that does stand out when you see it against other grasses. The other thing is that they have these stiff, strongly veined leaves that attach to the culm at about a 45 to 30 degree angle. And the spikes are quite closely overlapping. Awned wheatgrass, some of my information's missing, but spikelets are slightly overlapping, and the spikelets tend to have long awns, though there is a variety that doesn't have those awns, and it is bunchgrass. Northern wheatgrass also grows in clumps, and it is probably the most common wheatgrass that we see. It is more of a light green blue, and the blades attached to the culm at a much narrower angle. And so in this species, it's kind of in between western wheatgrass and awned wheatgrass in terms of how much the spikelets overlap in the head. These species also have some very fine features that can be used to differentiate between them. So in western wheatgrass, that one I started with in the center there, they tend to have claw-like auricles that are often purple in color. So if the leaf blades, that color doesn't key you in, the purple auricles may help you identify it. Northern wheatgrass tends to have more thread-like auricles, so you almost need to take out a loupe or a magnifying glass in order to see them, but they're very fine. Awned wheatgrass, sometimes they aren't present. They might be rudimentary, so they might be kind of stubby, or you might only have one auricle that shows up, though this species does have a more distinct ligule than the other two. In terms of our needlegrasses, we've got western porcupine grass, needle and thread, and green needlegrass. And again, these all are going to have those patterns that I mentioned previously. They're going to have that panicle inflorescence, and they're going to have those seeds with awns. So each of these are a bunchgrass. So they do have distinct leaves. I would say green needlegrass, the clumps of green needlegrass are probably the most distinct out of all of them. They tend to be fairly long, broad, stiff leaves. I would say needle and thread has the most distinctive head in that it has the longest awns of the three species. And often before the head comes out, it has this inflated sheath that almost looks like a little pocket surrounding the head before it opens up. And then western porcupine grass is kind of in between in terms of length of the awns of the other two species. Again, these have some fine features that we can use to differentiate between them. Western porcupine grass has a ligule that's notched in the center. And most people think of this ligule as the Batman helmet because it's down in the center and then it almost has the two little ears of the Batman helmet. Needle and thread has a much longer pointed ligule compared to the other two species. And then green needlegrass has these hairs that occur on the margin of the sheath, but also at the throat of the sheath there of the collar. So you get hairs in this area here. So those are the main wheatgrasses and the main needlegrasses. The last ones that I want to leave you with are just characteristic on site, and most people have little tricks and hints for identifying them. June grass has these spike-like panicles that almost look like a wheatgrass, but not quite. Plains rust fescue, which is common in the aspen parkland, has mostly basal leaves that grows in dense tufts. And the name rough fescue comes from how rough the blades are. They're very narrow blades, and they have these purple sheaths. If you run your fingers along the blades one direction, it's quite smooth. If you run them the opposite direction, it's very rough. And then one of the iconic prairie grasses is blue grama that has this comb spike-like head with the spikelets on one side, almost forms like a sickle shape. And it's a low-growing, mat-forming grass, and the leaves are quite curly. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So just to summarize, asters have those composite flower heads. Our legumes have those irregular flowers in the compound leaves. Our roses have 5 petals, 5 sepals, and many stamens. Our grasses, they have parallel veins in the leaves, and they also have nodes, which distinguish them from their sedges and the rushes. Our wheatgrasses have those spike inflorescences and auricles, and our needlegrasses have those panicles, large glumes, and those little seeds or florets with a terminal on. So that brings us to our quiz. So with this, I'm going to switch screens to the quiz and get this going. So here are the instructions. So if you find yourself at, I guess it's kahoot.it or the Kahoot app, you're going to enter the game with this pin, and you'll be asked to put in a name. And we can get going as soon as we have people joining up. Oh, wow, look at all the folks. I was feeling all lonely talking to myself, but there's a whole bunch of people. Oh, it's going to get competitive. Already up to 60 players. So one of the things that I want to tell you right off the get-go is the quiz is based on correct answers as well as time. So how quickly you can actually answer the questions. So we seem to be holding at 65 players. If you haven't, I would maybe copy down this PIN number. I don't know if it's available if you haven't managed to sign into the app or the website. So maybe write down this number before I start the quiz so you can join us. Okay, we're holding. I think we're good to start. So the first one's just to get us going. What is your favorite prairie plant species? You aren't graded on this. You have 30 seconds to type in your answer and just tell us what your favorite prairie plant is. All right. Dotted blazing star, heart-leaved Alexanders. Oh my gosh, rough fescue, blue grama, prairie sage, IPA, June grass, Saskatoon. Any. Okay, yeah, I agree. Great. So it looks like everyone's figured out how to use the app or the website, so we can move on. So this first round is beginner plant ID. Very, very simple, covers the species that we looked at today for the most part. And like I said, you're going to get points based on your speed and correctness. So there's 30 seconds to answer, or 20 seconds, I can't remember, to answer each question. So we'll start in 3, 2, 1. This is where the speed comes in. Everyone should know this one. Prairie crocus. Oh, Dita answered first out of everyone. All right, next. Haven't seen me before, but what plant family am I in? Ooh, it's a mixture. Aster or legume? The answer was legume. Fantastic. Let's see if and the scoreboard changes. We've got Andrew up top. Speedy fingers. Another, what family am I in? Almost everyone's got it right. Fantastic. Oh, Andrew's still at the top of the scoreboard. Name that grass. I feel like this will be fresh in everyone's mind, even though I covered it very, very briefly. The number of people participating is going up. Blue grama for the most part there. Awesome. Ooh, people are moving up. Name that plant. A little bit of a split, but for the most part, we've got everyone on golden bean. Good. Somebody's got to knock Andrew out of that top spot. He must be very, very adept at the buttons. This is another one of my favorites, I think. Good. Again, most people are right on track. Dotted blazing star. And he's knocked out of the top spot. We've got JMP now at the top. This one's a little bit tougher than the other ones. Which wheatgrass am I? Bit of a split, but still, everyone's kind of on the right track. It had those very thread-like auricles. Oh, leaderboard's changing quite a bit, but we've got 11 players that have answered 5 correctly so far. That's great. Name that plant. We've got a shrub this time. Again, everyone's doing really, really well. That is a wolf willow. The stem was a little bit covered there, and you couldn't quite see that characteristic color because of the scales in the close-up view. Ooh, LR has the highest answer streak of 8. Good job. This all comes down to how quick you are. Oh, we got a bit of a split, but yes, pasture sage. So this one is an indicator a little bit of overgrazing, though it is present everywhere. If you see a lot of it, it is an indicator of overgrazing, though. I didn't mention this, but do folks know what our provincial grass is? Oops, I didn't see what the spread was there. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the beginner round. Now, just a little fun for the plant ID masters out there. I had a few people submit some pictures and I found a few of my own, but there's just 5 more questions left for us. Name that plant. These ones aren't all necessarily in the presentation. These are just to test those folks out there that feel they've got that extra knowledge. Ooh, most of you guys got it. Definitely broomweed. Without flowers. Name that plant. A little bit of a split, but still most people are on track. I feel like there's some of you out there that could probably have taught this plant ID presentation better than I did. What do we got here? Again, bit of a split, but still most people are knowing these species. Got some ninjas out there. Now I guess this one really brought out the ninjas. So only 21 people got this one. This should bring those ninjas really to the top. Last question, guys. Again, only a few ninjas pulled this one out. That was blue grama. So remember those curly leaves that I mentioned very, very briefly? That was it. So here is the podium. In third place, we have JMP. Second place, we have SJ. And we have Liz up top in first place. Congrats, you guys. And then we have some runners up there at the bottom. Well, that's all I've got for you guys. And I think we are out of time. So I did want to thank you guys all for tuning in on your lunch hour on a Friday. And thank you very much for participating today.
That was really great. Thank you, Amanda. It's a good introduction for beginners and a great refresher for those who are familiar with these species. So it's really awesome. We have no questions typed in yet, so I don't know if you wanted to answer questions even though the hour is up.
I could maybe answer one or two, but I do have actually my own training to run off to in a second here.
Okay. Okay, there was just one question about the little poem, but that can be, like the webinar was recorded and it will be sent to everyone. It will be on our YouTube channel, so you can look at it there.
Did you want me to repeat the poem?
Is sure, that what if you want to, yeah.
Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes. What have you found?
Perfect.
Yeah, that's
it. So thank you so much, Amanda, for taking the time to give a presentation today. And thank you to the University of Saskatchewan and Amanda Muller for providing in-kind support for NPAW webinars. And as Amanda said, the field guides are available as a PDF on PCAP's website under Land Managers. And the Flora of Saskatchewan books that Amanda mentioned are available on the Nature Saskatchewan website if you wanted to order them. There will be a short survey once the webinar is over. Please fill them out to help with granting reports. And they'll also help us improve future PCAP and NPAW events. And with that, we hope you enjoyed Native Prairie Appreciation Week, the virtual edition, and have a great Friday and weekend.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you.